Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin, and we have a fantastic show tonight. You want to know why? Because I'm not hosting it. Here's my buddy Pete Hegseth, one of the nicest, smartest guys I know. And so every couple of years, when I have a book, I say, well, why not have Pete here, who will actually read the book, understand the book, and talk to me about the book and make it very intriguing and interesting. So I'm going to step out of the host mode. I'm going to turn the show over to Pete. Pete won't steal it, I promise, but he will conduct the interviews, and I want to thank you, Pete.
Well, I couldn't steal it if I wanted to, Mark. What an honor. Thank you for having me.
God bless you.
I appreciate it. You're handing your show over to your far less capable understudy, but I will tell you this. I studied this book. I read the whole thing cover to cover. I got an advanced copy of it. It is phenomenal. So congratulations on a great book. And out the gates here, I want to tell everybody, it's worth getting, reading, and giving to everyone you know who cares about the state of our republic. It's that important. And Mark, you know, the last time we were here, we were talking about American Marxism. Talk to the audience about how this is an extension of that. I think you can think of Marxism over here as a cultural thing, but when people see the Democrat Party hates America, people think they know the Democrat Party, but I don't think they do.
You know, the title of the book, I decided on the title when I finished the book. Same with American Marxism. And that title describes what's going on in this country today. So Marxism is obviously an alien ideology. It is a dangerous ideology. It's responsible for the death of 100 million people. Why? Because it's a failed ideology. The ideology is inhumane. It tries to take the human character and rejigger it and re-engineer it and build an entire ideology and society around this rejiggered, this re-engineered individual. The problem is God creates individuals. Man can't change individuals. We can create an environment where we can have law and order, where we can have a civil society, where people can flourish if we emphasize liberty in an economic system that works with liberty, capitalism, if we recognize sovereignty and a culture and assimilation into that culture. All these things have gone on for a long time, and they worked very, very well to create the greatest nation mankind has ever known, since there was mankind. And then there are these forces that seek to destroy it. There's always evil, there's always tyranny, and they take advantage of liberty. That's the first book, Liberty and Tyranny. Okay, we're now living in a society where nobody talks about liberty, where they trash our history, they rewrite our history, that the Democrat Party has essentially devoured the culture. It doesn't disagree with anything that's taking place, whether it's in the classroom, on the border, because it's created it. And so I finished American Marxism, and I thought to myself, well, what's next? And I watched the news. I watched Fox and Friends on the weekends, and during the week, I watch our cable channel. I watch some of the others. I read day in and day out, what are we doing? We're exposing what's happening to the country. And most of it's not good. Well, why is it happening? Is it Mother Nature that's doing all these things? No. It's mankind that's doing all these things. Okay, mankind, what does that mean? It's this party, the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party that defended slavery, that is responsible for the Civil War, that was the party of the Confederacy, that was the party opposed to Reconstruction, that is the party that pushed segregation for 100 years after the Civil War. It is the party of eugenics. It is the party of racism, segregation. It is the party that resegregated the military after the Republicans desegregated it. It is the party that resegregated the bureaucracy after the Republicans desegregated it. So I explained the history of the party and who's responsible for these things. Woodrow Wilson was an out-of-the-closet racist with ties to the Klan. I can give you a few examples right away, just so people have a taste. The book is obviously too involved for any one interview to really explain it. But Woodrow Wilson required for the first time that people who applied for federal jobs send in their photos so he could make sure blacks were not getting federal jobs. He also, when he was president of Princeton University, bragged about the fact that not one black kid was admitted to Princeton when he was the president of that university. He was the king of propaganda, the king of censorship. He wanted nothing to do with the black community. He wanted nothing to do with the black press. He wanted nothing to do with the NAACP. He was a bigot and a racist, and he was a two-term Democrat president. But the Democrats liked him. Why? Because he was one of the early Marxist intellectuals, so-called progressive intellectuals, talking about perfecting society. But for the sloppiness of the vote and the sloppiness of republicanism, the sloppiness of what goes on, he felt that the judiciary was where we could change America forever. He despised the Declaration of Independence. He wrote about it, why he despised the Declaration of Independence. Why? Because the so-called progressives, the Marxists, replaced their own ideology with that of the Lord.
Absolutely.
And that's why they attacked the family, because the family has a whole social construct that interrupts with their ideology. Faith has a whole social construct that interrupts with their ideology. The Constitution is set up to protect us from this party, the Democrat Party, even though people don't realize it. And I find it really hilarious and repulsive at the same time that you have Democrats today who condemn American history, but they don't condemn their own party.
Not only did they not condemn their own party, there's so many ways we could go on that, but on the issue of Woodrow Wilson, near the end of the book, when you talk about, I believe the chapter is Stalin Would Be Proud, they've revived the Espionage Act from 1917 that Woodrow Wilson used against a political opponent with Jack Smith and Donald Trump today. I mean, they're still using the same tactics.
There's an entire explanation when I go from chapter 3 to chapter 4 about the Democrat Party, that it is an autocratic party. It's not like the Republican Party. The Republican Party is a political party. In many ways, it is an ineffective party. In many ways, when people vote, it's the default party because they don't want to vote for the radicalism of the Democrat Party. But people don't even know what the Republican Party stands for because the Republican Party doesn't know what it stands for. It's a perfect foil for a different kind of party, the Democrat Party, that knows exactly what it stands for and where it wants to take the country. The Democrat Party is not merely a political party. It is an autocratic party that seeks to replace loyalty to the party to loyalty to the country.
And you call them the state party.
It is the state party, the state-run party, because why? They devoured our classrooms with the teachers' unions. They've devoured our universities and colleges with their Marxist tenured professors. They have devoured the whole idea of citizenship. The southern border is wide open. Climate change didn't cause that. Mother Nature didn't cause that. Mother Biden caused that. And the Democrat Party caused it. No matter how much they squeal in New York City, New York, they're still going to vote Democrat. Biden knows that. The Democrat Party knows it. So why are they doing it? If you understand the Democrat Party, you understand that you need to look through the lens of a power-hungry, autocratic party that doesn't give a damn about the country. The reason the border is open is so they can turn Texas blue. And when Texas is blue, the electoral game is over. The Republicans can never win the presidency. Same reason they want to get rid of the Electoral College. So only the populated areas of the country, the big cities on the coasts, maybe Chicago and Detroit, they're represented. Half the country has no representation after that. They want to take California's system and superimpose it on the entire nation. This whole voting issue, I know I'm moving widely.
No, I mean, you talk about H.R. 1.
H.R. 1, they immediately come into office, Pelosi, and they try and nationalize the voting system, blow out all the protections the states have. Their propaganda is, we want people to vote. We want them to have access to vote. Excuse me. The only people who should vote are the people who have a legal right to vote. It's not everybody gets to vote. Everybody doesn't get to vote. You need to be a citizen of the United States. And so what do? We had the cleanest election in American history. Did you know this? In 2020. That's what the press tells us. But think about this just for a second. We have less voting ID laws at any time in American history. You have drop boxes where they're not secure, nobody's watching, there aren't any cameras, anybody can drop anything into it. No signature in several states for absentee ballots, no dates in many states for absentee ballots. You have harvesting, voter harvesting. That means people are voting, or we're counting the votes after the election. You have some states where they have elections 1 month before the election. So the guardrails are blown out.
Automatic registration in Pennsylvania.
Automatic now in Pennsylvania if there's moderate Democrat governor. There is no moderate Democrat governor. But what's interesting here is this. We've had fraud virtually in every single presidential election. You've had Cook County, you've had Texas, you've had West Virginia, and the Democrats are better than anybody else at it. So the least secure election in American history, we're told, had no fraud. It's the cleanest election in American history. It's because they took fraud and they legalized it. They changed the system and they enshrined it. So when you go to court and sue and you say, well, this guy didn't have this guy didn't have that, so what? In your state, it's perfectly legal. Just as an example.
It's a great example. Well, it's sort of what Chapter 4 gets into as well, as far as word and thought control, changing dictionary. I mean, they take something that's so self-evidently not true, like it's the most secure election of all time, and they just repeat it over and over again until that's what everyone needs to say. Why are they so good at that?
If you're an autocratic party, you know what your mission is. It's to take control of society. This is what they do. And so if you have questions about man-made climate change, you're dismissed, you don't get a grant, you get a big scarlet letter carved into your forehead, you're a denier, like a Holocaust denier. There is no discussion. So they control knowledge, even when it's not knowledge, I'll call it knowledge. They control it.
Information.
Information. And they repeat it, and they repeat it, and they repeat it. I read several books about individuals who suffered through totalitarian regimes. The Third Reich, Stalin, Mao, Castro, they all say the same thing, Pete, which is control the language. Lenin said, the language needs to be changed to accommodate the party. To accommodate the party. So we're not even allowed to talk about women and men and what they are and so forth.
Oh, and that's what people are going to love about this book. I mean, in Chapter 4, you pull out a very unknown doctor who'd written, and he wrote, or you summarize, objective verification of ideas is rejected since no reality beyond the dictatorial opinion exists. This is not something Democrats have made up, it's something that they're mimicking. But in some cases, it was mimicked. I mean, we'll get into this later on with other autocrats who looked at the early progressives and said, man, that's something we can do here to control our people. And it all seems to come back to power.
In fact, they cannot tolerate different views. They cannot tolerate debate because we can't have paradise. We can't have utopia if we have these single individuals or small groups of individuals, if we have free speech. Free speech is the enemy. Discussion is the enemy. So why is that relevant today? Not only do you see the word changes, because when you change words, you change thought processes. When you change thought processes, you change action. And so what the Democrat Party wants is zombies. Now, how do we know that? Well, we had the greatest attack on free speech since the Civil War, quite frankly, by the Biden administration through censorship. Judges who've looked at this independently have been shocked at the extent to which the Biden administration used federal power to influence social media and social media platforms on everything from politics and the laptop to the virus and vaccines and everything in between. And I just want to be clear about something. As anemic as the Republican Party is, it doesn't do that. The Republican Party was not involved in lynching. The Republican Party fought slavery. People need to understand, and I do this through the discussion of Franklin Roosevelt. I take the most iconic Democrat in American history. They think he's the greatest president ever. Ask Doris Kearns Goodwin and all these historians and all the documentaries and all the rest of it, all the books and books and books. He was a racist. He was a bigot. He was an anti-Semite. I mentioned in 1940 a bill hit his desk, federal outlaw of lynching. He refused to sign it because he was running for an unprecedented third term and he wanted the vote out of the South. He did more than that. He backed his guy at the State Department who intentionally blocked Jews who were trying to escape the Third Reich and gas chambers from coming into the United States, even though they hadn't met their quota. There was a quota. They were way under the quota. And he also was successful, working with the New York Times, by the way, and other press outlets, to censor the Holocaust, what was taking place. We were bombing Nazi locations 5 miles from the train tracks that were taking Jews in Auschwitz. And he never bombed those train tracks. People say he didn't want to be diverted, from the Gulf. They were 5 miles from the train tracks. And then you look at his writings when he was working at the Navy Department and earlier about Jews. He actually had his staff, through government monies, hire an anthropologist. He was curious as a president about what he called the intermixing and admixture of races. This has always been part of the platform, unspoken perhaps, of the Democrat Party racism. And that's why one chapter I talk about anti-black racism, and now I talk about anti-white racism.
In the very next chapter, funny, I never read any of that about FDR in my high school textbooks. Never seems to make it.
And there's a lot more. It's a lot worse.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.